Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, an independent podcast. Our hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis, will have transparent and open conversations with the people driving modern security approaches forward, while leaving vendor hype behind. It's time to remove implicit trust and buzzwords and get to the root of the movement.
Hello and welcome back to Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT. I am your producer, Elliot Volkman, alongside your host, Mr. Neil Dennis. And today we're going to be looking at some fresh or some more recent research that will absolutely be impactful to any organization who either supports SMBs, is an SMB or startup, and maybe a little bit in between as well. So before we really get into the meat of it and the information in that research, Douglas, let's go with Doug, a little more casual, as is the nature of our series. Doug McKee is over at SonicWall, and he is an executive director of threat research, which, if you're familiar with our show, Mr. Neil Dennis has a little bit of background there, which, as you also know, he likes to pull us down a few different rabbit holes. So I suspect we will talk about research, but hopefully we'll get some other interesting conversations in the mix as well. With all that said, Doug, maybe you can give us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got into threat intel and threat research, and then we'll dig into the actual research that you have for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Elliot, for inviting to be on the show. And it's great to be able to talk about research with you all here today. So I've been in the cybersecurity space somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 years. I've been doing a little bit of everything. I've got a pretty broad background, jack of all trades, mostly in the offensive security space. I did a lot of red teaming, pen testing, vulnerability research. I've done malware analysis, breach analysis, all that type of fun stuff, and kind of settled in the VR and exploitation space over the last several years. I'm also a lead author and instructor for SANS. I authored their Security 568 class, which is combating supply chain attacks using product security testing. So that's obviously a passion of mine as well. But yeah, that's a little bit about me right now.
Very cool. So I don't want to ruin this and just list off here are these top 5 threats that are really impacting SMBs, but I do want to plant this seed before we kind of run into it, which I found was really interesting, is today in 2024, there are these top 5 or so threats that y'all in your research has identified. But what really stood out is that these aren't things that have just appeared in the last year or 2 years. Some of them stretch back to 2021. Or actually, one of these stretched back to 2012. So it's a little concerning that threats from that far back are still some of the biggest risks and challenges that an organization has to consider as far as, securing your cybersecurity posture and whatnot. So maybe we can kind of jump into that. Can you give us a little bit of a high level of your findings and, what we're about to discuss and some of the top threats currently targeting startups?
Yeah, absolutely. So the data comes from our IPS, or Internet Prevention System, intrusion prevention system. Can't talk today. Great for a podcast. So we get telemetry back from these devices, right? And they tell us a little bit about what attackers are attempting against SMBs and all types of businesses. Obviously, all data has biases, right? So our customer base is where we're getting this data, and our customer base is very high percentage, somewhere in the 90th percentile small businesses, right? That's why we've labeled it against small businesses for these threats. And what we're finding is that a large amount of the attacks that we're preventing through our signature database are really old attacks. Well, and so this data is from 2022 till the end of March. Today would be a slightly overstretched, right? And we're still seeing things like Log4j being the majority of attempts attackers are using against our organizations. We're still seeing things like Heartbleed as well, which is the one that you mentioned all the way back from, I think, 2012, if I'm not mistaken, right? That lingering around. Also attacks with Fortinet SSL VPN vulnerabilities from 2018. Atlassian makes the list with a 2021 vulnerability, and then VMware also makes the list in the top 5 also from 2021. So we can talk a lot and speculate about why this is being the case, if you want to move in that direction. But I think for the most part, there's something to do with time and what these vulnerabilities are actually in.
Yeah, we are absolutely going to jump into that. And I would just want to throw in a couple additional numbers that you all had sent our way, which is just to show the impact necessarily, but Log4j, you all see about 43% of organizations were under attack associated with that. For Fortinet SSL VPN issue, and I will not read off the CVE, 35%, Heartbleed, 35%, Atlassian's CVE that you already discussed was 32%, and VMware CVEs was 28%. So those are pretty big numbers. Obviously Log4j that's almost like half of your customers. I mean, not half, but
Right.
that is a large portion of people impacted by that. And Neil, I know, has definitely had conversations about that. It basically hit everybody overnight, but if it happened years ago at this point, maybe that is our jumping off point. Why are we still seeing that? Are organizations not prioritize solving it? They not feel like they have the solutions to solve against these issues? Yeah, let's pivot over towards that direction.
I think you can actually group two of these. You can group Log4j and Heartbleed and talk about them together to answer that question. I think the underlying root cause here is they're essentially supply chain vulnerability, right? These are underlying libraries. They don't exist in one singular product. And that means that vulnerability is literally all over the place. And one of the challenges with that then for our organizations, especially small businesses who may be under resources, simply identification. Where is this vulnerability within my infrastructure? What products are using it? You can still come out and hear of someone that found out, oh, Log4j was used in this application or this piece of hardware that we didn't know it was used in 6 months ago. And so that makes it a very valuable vulnerability for attackers to continue to leverage, on top of the fact that, and this kind of applies to all 5 of them, the more time that a vulnerability or a threat exists, the more research that can go into it. Right. And so what happens is attackers, and actually even the good guys like researchers, put more time into understanding how that attack can be perfected. And when you combine that again with the supply chain space, it only takes one more application. They're more widespread, and attackers can get a real big bang for their buck there. So I think at least talking about those two to kick it off with, that's a large portion of why you're seeing organizations being sprayed with those attacks.
Interesting. So Neil, before I give you your host hat, maybe we pull that off, and being the threat intel guy, do you feel like that perspective jives with you? Does that make sense? Like, these attacks are still evolving. We're finding out more information. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's 100% spot on. It's the scope and scale of those. And since we're talking SMB, to Doug's point, I guarantee I could go to town right now and look at pretty much every small business here that has anything beyond just a payment system, and I'm going to find something. I don't care who their MSSP is. I don't care how they've set up. One of these is going to show up if they have a tech debt reprised for. But I think the other part of the problem is when we first have these issues like Log4j and the rest, we may not necessarily have the actual fix directly for that the day it comes out or the day we're made aware of it. Most of the time we are. I think Log4j, before they published sites, I think they had the initial fix, and Heartbleed just came out of nowhere and disclosed open before we had a fix. But that being said, the fix is sometimes AWS going, now we put something on the endpoint devices or further out, maybe in the actual DMZ, to say, no, we'll modify it and notify you if someone makes an effort, but you don't actually fix it. You just put a stopgap and then you forget about it. And I think that's the other part of the issue, is those stopgaps eventually disappear when you change service providers, and you still have those exploits open in your solution somewhere. So yeah, obviously they're using them. They wouldn't keep putting them in their payloads if they weren't effective. And then to the last point on Doug's side, the longer it's out, the more nuanced we can get with avoiding whatever those limitations are, even the patches to some extent. Because, well, getting back to Log4j, or at least maybe not Log4j, but some of the VM stuff, some of those patches sometimes are, hey, put this signature in our solution and you're good. All right, we're going to evade that signature in a couple of weeks once we figure out what it actually is. Because you're not fixing, once again, the actual issue. You're just trying to put something in between it and the real issue. And so a lot of vendors have lovely ways of doing that instead of fixing, right? So yeah, I think it's 100%.
I think as we continue to think about, as you talked about MSSPs changing and companies switching out with their protections and not fixing the root cause, I think another thing we can talk about in that realm is patching struggles when it comes to compliance and regulatory organization. I think that's another reason why these things are such a big win. So yeah, they're older vulnerabilities, but go to a healthcare provider and tell them that the only way to fix that vulnerability is to spend millions of dollars pushing out device X. And all of a sudden their desire to do that drops incredibly. And then of course you have things like HIPAA and all other kind of regulations that have to re-go through their process just to fix this vulnerability. I also think it's important to highlight the struggle of some in some sectors. Like, it's a really hard thing to accomplish, and it's not always the end organization's fault, right? They're at the mercy of some of these other vendors. And that also means, again, that attackers are going to find success in using these things. I used to do a lot of penetration testing for healthcare systems, which is why you end up hearing a lot of my side boards end up being in healthcare. But it wasn't that many years ago that I was doing a test and I ran into a Windows XP machine long after Windows XP was end of life. And when asking the question to the organization, why am I able to compromise this XP machine and own half your network, was like, we can't switch out that hugely expensive piece of equipment because it affects our medical care. And we don't, where does IT meet medical care in that space? So I think that's like an initial layer on why do we still have these age-old vulnerabilities that are effective.
Yeah, I think that's the other fun part. Back on the IT, OT chain of things and healthcare, ID, all the other fun stuff that goes in all that. So availability versus uptime, he wants to take stuff down so it stays up when it comes back, and OT world needs to stay up so they make money and nobody yells at them. It's two counterintuitive process flows for people trying to secure a network. And you're right, stuff like this lives down in the weeds. And I'll say this, I guarantee everyone listening that no matter what tool you're using, whether it's what we're using to record today, or whether it's your Gmail or something even smaller tool stack, I guarantee you there are vulnerabilities in it that company is aware of, or they put mitigations in front of them to monitor for those because they don't have the right way to patch it to make it go forward. And whether it's enterprise tech stack or open source tech stack, those exist. It's what happens when they start pushing additional updates around that to maintain the monitoring when those doors start to open back again. And that's the fun part of the story, both as a product producer and provider, as well as a consumer. They're there. They may tell you they're fixed, but what they really mean most of the time is, now we're just making sure nobody can take advantage of it while we figure out how to fix it. And then they forget about it a year later, and then the floodgates are open again.
Because sometimes it comes down to a cost thing too, especially if we start talking about hardware devices. To remove a vulnerability could be a slight re-architecture. Then how do you handle that re-architecture if you're the vendor and then pushing an update for that? As you said, they put some type of mitigating factor in place of it. I saw one vulnerability not that long ago where the solution was, it was unauthenticated, now it's authenticated. And that was their solution, which, yes, adds a layer of protection, but doesn't fix the issue.
Yeah, that's always the fun one. We were, slight tangent, but the one that the gentleman we just interviewed, he's, vulnerability risk management guy and Patch Tuesdays, this and all that fun stuff. And same thing. Yeah, I think it's hilarious because he said basically the same deal. Like, it's still a vulnerability. You just changed how we access it just a little bit to provide maybe a small monitoring aspect, but I could still get around it and take advantage of it. So thank you for not actually fixing the problem then. So I am curious if Elliot wants me to be curious at the moment.
I'm not going to hold you back. Come on now.
No,
we got through the research. Now it's free range.
Some of the questions and asks that you had in here, some of the things in the list that you're happy to speak to. I got some curiosity questions around. But when we think about y'all as a tech stack and what y'all are doing, what you do to look at this data, but what's some of the key things? Like, what's some of the ways that you've approached this data stack to come up with your findings would be a good question. I'm an Intel guy, so I like to understand people's actual methodology. And it's politely spelled out in here that you would do that with us. So I'm very curious about your methodology. No, what's your approach and what's your intent from your overall methodology for this research?
So we get tons of data back from all of our products and all of our sensors. And oftentimes I run the IPS content team. We produce signatures on a daily basis for all these threats that we're talking about. And we're constantly rinsing and repeating and saying, like, how do we make our signatures better? Like, what should we be focusing on for small businesses specifically? And so when reviewing the telemetry data, oftentimes we look at what are the signatures with the highest hits? Like, what is people getting spammed with today? How can we make those signatures more generic? And I simply just took a step back and was like, all right, let's look at what widespread these attacks are instead. Because if I want to focus on something to improve signature base, I want to help as many people as possible. I don't want to just help one organization, whether it's one small customer or one big customer. I want to try to help all of them. So the methodology was here to just start tweaking the way we approach it and say, what's affecting most of our organization? And so that's how we got to, oh, these are the top 5 most widespread attacks. And what's interesting too is there's like a huge cliff. So the reason I published the top 5 is I think after we get off of here, we go from 28% down to like single digits as far as not quantity of attack, but widespread attack. And in fact, there's some vulnerabilities out there that have a much higher quantity attack today, but they're only hitting a few organizations. They're more targeted. And so it's what is affecting most of our customers. And that's where this came from. That was the back end methodology, is how can we improve what we're looking at from widespread? And it's really interesting to look at that these are the older ones. And so I think some of the methodology going forward is anything like supply chain related is going to get a lot more attention because it's being hit in a wider group of people. Things we can speculate on, why is Fortinet, Atlassian, and VMware on the top of the list looking at this data. And of course, completely speculatory, but some things to think about is Fortinet's an edge device, right? Attackers get a hold of one of the largest vendors. Cisco's obviously in that ballpark as well. But if you get a hold of edge devices, that's game over for a lot of attackers, because internal defenses versus external defenses, they don't have to fish, right? You've got that as a possibility. VMware infrastructure, kind of like Fortinet, cloud computing, a lot of VMware infrastructure there. So again, the overall theme being biggest bang for your buck type thing from attackers. And then I think Atlassian is the most interesting one personally. And that has to do with, in my opinion, stealing data. Probably one of the largest providers for things like wiki and project management and task in those areas. What can we either ransom back to you, or what can we sell on the black market, or what can we use to pivot? A lot of that stuff's posted in those technologies. A long-winded answer, but I think ultimately trying to protect as many people as possible.
Yeah, I think that's cool. It makes sense. So I've got a slight stub question on Atlassian stuff, or at least an anecdote from my side that might turn into a question. The one of the supply chain risks that I saw play out a while back, someone, just like with GitHub, they were trying to get access to someone's Jira setup so they could change like the code base in sprints as it was being shared directly at Atlassian and Confluence pages. So they were trying to get in so they could corrupt, like with SolarWinds style, corrupt the source code or some part of the code as the engineering team was doing their thing. But my curiosity question is, so you mentioned ransomware and extortion, stuff like that. So as y'all are doing this research, are you able to, or are you intending to look at who the threat actors are that are going forward with this to see what those exploit packages might lead to as well? Is that part of that overall effort?
So there's, we gather data differently for different products. So in this specific effort, the reason I'm specific about network attacks or widespread is I'm specifically looking at like IPS network traffic data. As far as attribution and where these attacks are coming from, a lot of that comes from actually some of our sandboxing technology, where we can actually deeply analyze a lot of the malware that we get that come through the firewall boxes. So that's a different area, and they don't always necessarily match up one-to-one, as I'm sure you'll understand. I guess the short answer is yes, we're doing that. We have yet to be able to dive into it with this specific information as far as where are the log4j attacks currently coming from. I don't have that information.
No, that's all good. No, it's just a curiosity question. Like I said, as an Intel analyst, as a government trade Intel analyst, I should say, because there's a difference in the scheme of things. You've got two sides of the fence, the one where attribution is king, and one where who gives a pants, let's just continue to block stuff. Right. And so that's why I asked the question. Maybe over a different colon of beer, I'll ask you where you sit on that fence so I can either agree or tell you you're very, very wrong. So that's good insights. I think from an iteration though, knowing that y'all as a company, one, you're looking at the threat. B, y'all have a larger teaming capability that will attempt to look at to some layer of attribution or some layer of intent. Thinking down a little bit more on this, I want to get back on the MSP side of the house a little bit, because from a supply chain perspective as a whole, obviously SMBs, I don't remember what the latest numbers are because it always goes back and forth every couple of years. One year we're looking at 3/4 of the SMBs are all using an MSP of some sort. And then you flip it around and suddenly they all want to go spend $1 million to start their own thing. And now we're down to 60% or something. I don't know. But from an MSP engagement perspective, what's some of the insights or ideas to maybe push your MSP to help you do these things or maintain this? Or better yet, secondary question, if you decide to change a service provider, what are some of the things you might suggest to carry forward with that around these types of supply chain risks and concerns that they might need to take with them?
So I think there's multiple ways in which MSPs can help with this issue. I think it boils down to two main things. I think we can talk about resource constraints and we can talk about complexity, right? So we talked about startups briefly earlier in the conversation, and you can have these startups that are like, one day there's 3 to 10 people, and all of a sudden, like 2 to 3 weeks later, they're 100 or even more, a larger startup, because they're all of a sudden they're being successful, their product's selling, et cetera, et cetera. And they move from this category of trying to work out of their mom's garage and to something where we actually need like security, like we need to think about these things. I mean, it's really easy to all of a sudden get this like concept of shadow IT. I'm sure that's a term you guys have heard before, and you don't know what you don't know. And so MSPs, coming back to the question here, MSPs can come in and really help provide the resources required to understand the complexity of your network, where you may have deficiencies, and then make suggestions without the need for hiring a dedicated security team, training them up, spinning them up on a regular basis. So I think that's definitely one way they can help. Automated patching, a lot of MSPs have that down to a science because they do that for a large customer base. And they can probably implement something, or they can implement something for you a lot quicker than if you were able to, again, try to do this yourself.
Cool. So I think as we dive down into the MSP bucket here, I definitely lived the startup life going from 5-person to more a couple of times now. And you go from having nothing on your box managed wise to all of a sudden you wake up the next day and there's automatic reboots and updates on what do we do here? But patch management. So back on that. So if we think about MSPs as the variations of service, some of them have after hours, 24/7, whatever, SOC roles, whatever. But I think that's a really good niche thought that people don't take into account is you can hire an MSP to be your IT administrator. They don't have to necessarily be your security from the SOC perspective, if that's not what you're looking for, but you can hire someone to bring that wealth of experience to help you with the patch management exclusively or in the vulnerability management aspect. And there's definitely some companies out there that's what they specialize in is, hey, let us come in once a month and break everybody's stuff for you and they'll be mad at us and not you. Or every 2 days when Chrome decides to update and you have to refresh all your freaking tab. Thinking on that, what do you have any thoughts on like maybe transitioning? Let's say if you're questioning your service providers on what they've done, are there any things related to these vulnerabilities or constructs around vulnerability management that someone should ask their current provider so when they go to a new provider, or if they're peeling back away from a provider? Other than just, I know my obligatory question is, how the heck did you do that? And thank you. But but do you think there's any additional insights around transition period and all that other fun stuff to maybe have a list like this to go, hey, what did you do? And is this still relevant today? Or do I need to take some other mitigations moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things we can talk about. Like if I was interviewing an MSP, for example, or trying to figure out if I want to switch or not. And one thing I would consider is, what is that MSP doing specifically for your organization that's not necessarily cookie cutter for every organization, right? Are they taking the time to realize that if let's say you're in a different industry, let's say that you're in finance, are they applying the same rules that they're applying to the medical industry? Or are they applying the same rules that they're applying to the tech industry and their methodologies and the way they approach things? Because at the end of the day, what protection comes down to often is prioritization. And you have to have an intake of threat intelligence for where you're sitting at in the organization. Like the list that we're talking about here, the top 5 most widespread attacks, not to everybody in the world, but to small businesses. That's going to exist differently when you're trying to protect, not that you would do this, but if for Microsoft, right? If Microsoft was interviewing MSPs, and as I said, not that you would do that, but that's going to be very different than if it's some small company that only has 200 people and is in a completely different industry. So I think how you go about prioritization and customization when it comes to threat intelligence, which is driving how you act. Do you have threat intelligence? Or what is your threat intelligence intake, and how is it related to again, my organization? Are you an MSP that specializes in preventing Windows attacks and I'm an Apple shop, right? What experience do you have in Apple? So it seems simple, but those are the things that are really going to matter further down the road. And I'll give you one more, and this can fall in or outside the MSP space. You could sometimes considered more consulting, if you will. Do you have the expertise on your staff to do things to leverage skills like product security testing? Because when we talk about threats like Log4j and Heartbleed, and we already mentioned the hardest problem is identification, right? How do I know if I have it? The best way to know that you have it is someone that can break down the products in your company and tell you what is being used from a library perspective. And that comes from techniques like product security testing. So that's an advanced question to ask MSP. Do you offer those type of services, or can you help me with that so I don't have to be trying to do it on my own?
And I want to be clear. The reason why I keep harassing you about various weird things like this is because as someone who focuses on SMBs, obviously like you do, a lot of people have questions like this around these type of things. So it's good to get perspective on what they should be thinking to ask and how they should be managing. On that same vein, back on SMB/supply chain a little bit more, you hinted at bill of materials a little bit and having someone that may help you discover that. So I want to iterate on the bill of materials piece a little bit, and the SBOM and all the other stuff that we have to put up with depending on who we're servicing. But as good as it is to obviously have self-discovery, and you need that is a exceedingly needed skill set to be able to have, whether you pay for it extra or you have it intrinsic to your security team. And then the other part of that is back on the SBOM side of that. Depending on how big of a company you are and what you're doing to support what your company is doing, back on healthcare versus finance versus someone who's just making cogs for a car that nobody cares about. If you're an SMB supporting a very large provider somewhere, or if you're a cog in a much larger supply chain for a big entity, and one or two echelons down, I think the other thing people could think of is soliciting who it is that they're providing resources for. So if I'm making a cog for Honda or Hyundai, one of the H whatevers, or Ford, versus making a cog for someone who's just trying to make a new EV in their garage, and that's it. I might be able to go to Honda and be like, hey, I'm one of your primary suppliers. Help me figure out what's going on in my system, or help me figure out what's critical for me to keep you going, and then use that from a priorities perspective. I think SMBs, we focus a lot on them because they have their own buckets of problems. But I think an SMB as well should also think of trying to solicit who it is up chain from them that has the billions of dollars to maybe help them maintain some kind of awareness on what they should focus on. And then maybe take that back to someone like you and whoever else as well and say, hey, from a supply chain perspective or from a product perspective, here are the things that we actually care about. It's a weird world.
It's a very weird world.
It's a different set of rules. Back to your point, Microsoft versus the cog maker. Microsoft is going to get whatever the heck they ask for. And they're going to be able to.
I also think in that line of thinking, it's also important to realize that attackers don't only go after the Microsofts, right? They go after the cog makers because often, using your terminology, oftentimes because they know that they don't have the resources necessarily. And if they get the cog makers, then they can maybe get into Hyundai or the next level up because you might be doing business with them. And sometimes that means that you're actually more of a target because you can be used as a Trojan horse other places. Yeah. If we look at like breaches like the Home Depot breach back in the day, or the casino that was hacked in 2017 by the internet connected fish tank, right? Just because you're not the big fish in the market, no pun intended, like you may actually be the vehicle that is being used. So absolutely, you need to leverage as many reaches as you can. I like to joke all the time, attackers are lazy. They're no different than me and you, right? They don't want to do the hard way. And I think that's ultimately what with these widespread attacks. They don't want to find a custom 0-day or leverage some like ridiculously Windows vulnerability that requires ROP chains and exploit mitigations and the bypass CFG and all that fun stuff. They want to run a script that runs log4j that gets you into their network, or they want to send a phish. So they're going to find the avenues that works for them, especially if we see these numbers. If 43% of organizations are being hit by log4j, you have to argue that attackers must be having success with it at a pretty large rate.
Yeah. That's exactly it. We're not going to spend time burning cycles against stuff when we have a finite, as threat actor, finite span to be able to take advantage of something before whatever it is we're soliciting with, reconning, reconnoitering with gets popped and turned away. So yeah, if you're going to throw everything that you've seen work currently and then come back a few days later, if none of that worked, and try something new until you do find something. But yeah, if Log4j is still in the exploit paths, it's definitely getting someone somewhere. And otherwise it'd be
also, sometimes depending on who you are, if it doesn't work, they'll move on to a different target.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you just have to be able to run faster than the guy behind you. I think it's worth highlighting that too, that there's such a huge value in making sure that you're protected. Again, like it's worth time and investment, because the ones that these are working with are going to be the victim.
And this kind of comes back to a little bit of a nuance on SMBs and supply chain for me, and stand up slightly on a soapbox for a few seconds. But if you're in an SMB world, once again, you have a community, and this is things I think people also need to realize. You talk about outrun the guy behind you, 100%, please. But at the same vein, if you're seeing these things as a consumer, and so this is where your research to me is valuable, because you're doing some of this because they obviously can't in that sense. So as a SMB, as a Intel provider, or at least an Intel consumer, someone who has the ability to understand what my footprint looks like from a threat perspective, or what's hitting me at least a little bit, I should be able to take that info back to my peer groups and harden my peer group even more. So then once again, as a group, we're less likely to get targeted in the future by those whatever they may be, and then bring that data forward. And so when you create something like this, research wise, to your point, it's what's the biggest impact across the most people that you can think of and look for. And that's what this is. This is taking your data set, your understanding, and letting SMBs as a whole know, hey, look, guys, SMB in general, here's the things you got to worry about, because they know that y'all are softer targets. So take care of these big things, make sure they're good to go, and then let's move on to what the next flavor of the day is, and we'll keep the ball rolling forward. And I think that's a very important aspect that some people miss in the threat space. When we talk about public disclosures and things like that, and there's pros and cons on either side of the fence. So you putting out a product like this that says, here's the top 5 threats, it's probably going to make some threat actors stop using it. But that's a good thing in the grand scheme of stuff, because that means they know that they're being caught with this stuff. They know they need to shift away from it, especially if they want to come after a particular customer base. The downside is they're going to shift and come after new things, but it takes them time to retool. It takes them time to come back for it. And that's why Intel is a repetitive cycle, and we rinse, lather, repeat. And in 9 months, you're going to write the next top 5 threats for SMBs, and hopefully it'll be a little different. And that's a good win ROI-wise. So, yeah.
Something that's actually not written here that is also interesting on the same vein, back in October, predictions are a big thing in cybersecurity, right? They're like, hey, what's going to happen in 2024? And I just started to look at some of this data, didn't have it all pulled together yet. And I noticed that there was a trend with Log4j specifically, and the trend was that it was upward basing. Like we were starting to see more and more attack on Log4j. And so I had made a prediction that in 2024, it's going to continue to go up. Now, obviously we haven't seen all of 2024 yet, but so far, when I looked at this in March to start putting together, okay, last 2 years, what are we seeing? It was higher than it was in October. So I think to your point, we need to change the direction a little bit, right? And how do we do that is we have to bring awareness to what the issues are, so that way we can force them to take a step back and come up with a new tactic.
Yeah. Ellie, I know you wanted to say something at a few times here before we wrap up, given time permission.
What are you talking about?
I want to be mindful that. So he sits here and he goes, you hear his intro, right? He's like, hey, I'm the whatever producer, back in person, whatever, Elliot. And then here's your host, Neil. And I have to remind him that he does all the work. He's not just a producer. He does a lot.
I do so little work. Talking is the worst, so I'd much rather do what I do. I do have a question, though. It might tee off a conversation that I've got going on at RSA with OWASP and MITRE. So this will be a good jumping off point, or it might be a follow-up, whichever order we publish this. So this research focuses on SMBs and startups. I'm curious, since these are like the top 5, how would an organization, a startup, or an SMB be able to identify if these are things that they should prioritize? If you look at whatever articles that you read, the headlines, this ransomware is hitting us, these phishing attacks are hitting us, how do you differentiate between all of the things that you see spread everywhere, a little bit of excess media hype, versus what an organization of a certain size in a certain industry should do? And this also blends right back over to threat intelligence. Figured I'd throw that one out there.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard problem, right? Like at the end of the day, like how do you know what to ignore and how do you know what to listen to? The concept of prioritization is key, especially for CISOs, right? Like it's their job to basically say, this is the risk that's most important for us to tackle. This is the risk we're going to accept. That's a whole nother conversation we can talk about later about risk acceptance. So how do we approach this as businesses? And I think, or at least as small businesses, the first thing I would say is, my prioritization for small businesses is you can't know what to protect against if you don't know what you have. Period. End of discussion. So if you don't have a good understanding of what's on your network, like and where it's being used and all that fun stuff, then it doesn't matter what the headlines are, because you don't know how to properly implement the protections, because you don't know what to ignore and you don't know what to listen to. So to me, that's the first big piece of the puzzle, where I think a lot of SMBs get caught up in what was the headline I saw the other day? Quantum computing is going to make RSA obsolete, or something to that effect. Yeah, let that be tomorrow's problem, right? Today's problem is, and what we're showing here with this little bit of research is, you need to shore up the old stuff first, which means I have to know if the old stuff exists on my network. The silly answer to your question is, where do I get my prioritization from? From myself, internally. I need to get my prioritization from my, if you will, my internal SBOM. What am I using? And then on top of that, then you want to take into, there's tons of factors that can go into prioritization once you have that. But I would argue you want to stick with, first, what is your mission critical functions? Those need to probably be prioritized as far as protection goes. Not suggesting that, yes, I know we can sit here and say that it doesn't have to be mission critical and attackers can get into your network using it and then they can compromise other things. Again, different discussion. But if I'm talking about prioritization, I want to make sure that I'm shoring up my mission critical stuff first, because they affect my bottom line. And also having the mentality of not if I'm going to get compromised, when I get compromised, and thinking that I'm already compromised. Like if we can shift the mindset to that and not have organizations saying, oh, well, I've got protection XYZ, so they're not going to get me. That's a very old or antiquated methodology. So when you're talking about prioritization, prioritize what you have, prioritize how you're thinking about your security. In other words, consider yourself already compromised. Did I protect my mission critical assets, or make it extremely difficult for those to be the ones that have given access to? And then leverage threat intelligence and different tools that are able to provide you stuff specific for your industry.
I think it's very well said. I know who you are, know what you are, and know what the heck's screwed up as best as you can. And just one last piece. You said it earlier, you need a resource to drive into what's actually there, what's actually going on. You need to have someone somewhere on a team somehow that understands how to be red team to some extent. And you yourself, obviously, having come from that back end, know that better than most, I hope. And then red team your stuff. Even if it's some intern from a university that pays and works for coffee, let them come in and try to break your crap. Better them than someone else.
Absolutely. In the SANS class that I teach, we use this phrase called think red, act blue. And it talks about this methodology of, we have to always be thinking about from an attacker's mindset. And then what separates us apart is what we do with that action. So to your point, whether it's an intern or whether you can hire an MSP or an MSSP to help you with bringing in that mindset, like that's what you need to prioritize when we're talking about of a protection standpoint. Because you don't know, you don't know.
So I know we're coming up on time, but I got two last questions. One, I would like, since you're doing SANS stuff, I'm all for you personally pitching your SANS course if you're up for it and what the number is. And then for our listeners, throw it back over to Doug to let you know where to go get some fun stuff here from the SANS side of the house.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to pitch the SANS class. Obviously I'm biased. I think it's a fantastic class. It's Security 568. So that's combating supply chain attacks using product security testing. Two things we talked about today on the podcast, right? Product security testing and supply chain attacks. And it's very fundamental in the concept of knowing what you have, but not just knowing what you have and trusting what the vendor provides you. But we do two things in that class. One, we provide you a repeatable methodology, step-by-step process on how to do that product security testing. I challenge you to go Google product security testing and find something like that didn't come from my class, right? Before we wrote this class last year, no one could tell you how to do product security testing. We actually have a free poster you can go download. If you Google SANS Security 568, then you do Google poster, it'll come right up and you can grab the methodology poster that we provide in that class. And again, it's going to show you the repeatable methodology on how to do product security testing. Of course, it's a 5-day class, so we dive into that pretty extensively during the class, more than you're going to get on the poster. But I think that really is key in understanding what you have on your network. One of my favorite things we do is we even talk about how to break down proprietary protocols. You were mentioning medical industry, financial industry, OT earlier. Again, you don't know what you don't know. When you've got these network packets going across your network and you have no idea how to parse them, how do you protect yourself? You figure out what they're doing. And so
So I know we're coming up on time, but I got two last questions. One, I would like, since you're doing SANS stuff, I'm all for you personally pitching your SANS course if you're up for it and what the number is. And then for our listeners, throw it back over to Doug to let you know where to go get some fun stuff here from the SANS side of the house.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to pitch the SANS class. Obviously I'm biased. I think it's a fantastic class. It's Security 568. So that's combating supply chain attacks using product security testing. Two things we talked about today on the podcast, right? Product security testing and supply chain attacks. And it's very fundamental in the concept of knowing what you have, but not just knowing what you have and trusting what the vendor provides you. But we do two things in that class. One, we provide you a repeatable methodology, step-by-step process on how to do that product security testing. I challenge you to go Google product security testing and find something like that didn't come from my class, right? Before we wrote this class last year, no one could tell you how to do product security testing. We actually have a free poster you can go download. If you Google SANS Security 568, then you do Google poster, it'll come right up and you can grab the methodology poster that we provide in that class. And again, it's going to show you the repeatable methodology on how to do product security testing. Of course, it's a 5-day class, so we dive into that pretty extensively during the class, more than you're going to get on the poster. But I think that really is key in understanding what you have on your network. One of my favorite things we do is we even talk about how to break down proprietary protocols. You were mentioning medical industry, financial industry, OT earlier. Again, you don't know what you don't know. When you've got these network packets going across your network and you have no idea how to parse them, how do you protect yourself? You figure out what they're doing. And so that's one of the things that we talk about on a deeper technical level in that class.
Yeah, just don't try to push a packet back out until you know what it's doing first.
Yeah, absolutely.
I used to work OT side of the house and proprietary, pick a flavor of the day, bus this, mod bus, propy bus, all the other fun buses. I may or may not have learned that one the hard way. And then last but not least, before I let Elliot close this out real fast, SonicWall, I just want to iterate on that, where you're coming from, the research that y'all produce, and the fact, like right off the bat, you talked about how as a company, that a large percentage of your client base is SMB focused. And I just want to iterate on that for everybody listening, that if you're looking for SMB support and stuff, there are companies like SonicWall out there that do have a focus of the day that does help y'all more than someone like Microsoft.
Yeah, absolutely. Our everyday focus is SMBs, and we have an MSP service that we offer to a recent acquisition, Solution Granite. And if you're looking for an MSP to help you with this. We are specializing in small businesses. And so we're looking at the threats on a regular basis to that industry and providing that intelligence and then leveraging that through our MSP. Definitely specialized for that area.
Reach out to Doug. Doug likes to play sales rep. I'm kidding. Yeah.
Absolutely. Someone's got to pick up the phone, right?
All right. Oh, Ellie, I'm good, bud. I'm done. I wanted to get a good point for
let's take it
Sans.
home. For clarification, this was not a paid advertisement. Neil is just very nice. So just putting that out there. Otherwise, we're generally vendor neutral in how that all works. But Doug, thank you so much for being here, sharing your expertise and your insight and that research with us. I think anywhere that we can help elevate information and identify areas of prioritization, even though, as you had clearly stated, that information needs to come from within, I think it's super important for us to be able to do that. So Neil and I are always very happy to identify that kind of research, build a platform, and that is essentially what we've done outside of just rambling and terrorizing other marketing people. That's what we're here for. So Doug, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that expertise. We really appreciate it.
I thank you so much for having us. It was great to have a chat with y'all for a little while and happy to do it again anytime.
Thank you for joining AZT, an independent series. Your hosts have been Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis. To learn more about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Slack community. Viewpoints expressed during the show do not reflect the brands, employers, or companies of our hosts, guests, or potential sponsors.